talking about good, clean, and fair slow food for all. This is the second part of our lecture series. Good, clean, and fair is the motto for slow food, and so we're focusing today on the clean. As you can see on the screen, by clean food, we refer to food that is produced without harm to the environment, whether it's farming locally, regionally, nationally, or internationally. Our panelists are providing varied perspectives of educating consumers, students, and farmers. Indeed, we ask this question of how do we balance care for the planet and the life that it sustains. This is being sponsored by the Anthropology Public Outreach Program and Slow Food Columbus. So just as a reminder, once everything's back up and running, APOP will be back someday with fun and exciting programming. So hopefully that'll be a lot sooner rather than later. If you haven't already, we encourage you to register for one of Slow Food USA's upcoming webinars. All of these are free and open to the public, and you can see the link below, slowfoodusa.org/slowfoodlive. We've also got that link up on our Facebook pages, and you can check out Slow Food USA. Anything from bread making to seeds and garden kits to all things that you can do with food at this time. And with that said then, tomorrow at 2 p.m., Cynthia Walters, who is working with our school garden program, doing a lot of education outreach, she'll be presenting on sowing cool weather seeds under low tunnel tomorrow. Again, that's at 2 p.m. The link here is available for you to register. It's another Zoom presentation. Like I said, we're going to be running this with everyone's microphones muted except for the speaker. We'll ask you to turn off your video as the presenters are giving their talks. That should help with the bandwidth issues, just so that's not conflicted. You can turn those all back on and we can give it a go with the Q&A session. Feel free again to use the chat function to ask us questions, and we'll go through as many of those as we can get to at the end of the talks. At the end of the event, I'll have a brief survey link. There'll be a QR code that you can just scan with your phone, or you can also see the website. If you can take a moment, it's 2 to 3 minutes long, just to help us improve upon this experience for the next event. That would be super helpful. And finally, again, as I mentioned earlier, this meeting is being recorded and will be made available to all of those who weren't able to join us this evening. And so with that, we're going to begin with Trevor Horn, who is our Slow Food Reynoldsburg Coordinator, and he's on our Slow Food board. He's the agriculture and food science teacher within the Reynoldsburg School District system.
Hey guys, first and foremost, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. I know it's a beautiful day here, at least in Ohio. It's one of the first we've had in a long time. So I really think it's great for us to get an opportunity to collaborate and introduce ourselves to one another and get an opportunity to just spread the word of good, clean, fair food for everyone. So a little background about myself. I teach high school agriculture and food science at Reynoldsburg, Ohio. Reynoldsburg's high school's Health Science and Human Services STEM Academy, located on Livingston Avenue in Reynoldsburg. We are in our first year of introducing students to Ohio Department of Education's Food Science Career Pathway curriculum. Along with that, we've built a urban farm on some old abandoned tennis courts that we don't use anymore, and hope to build connections with students and where their food comes from. We're actually the first Slow Foods chapter, high school chapter in the United States, which is pretty cool. We're hoping to use this as a vessel to be able to transport starting kits across the nation to implement school gardens, at least at the high school level, and to trickle down into elementary school levels as well. So one of the things I can say is I can promise there's never a dull moment in my high school teaching day, particularly when it comes to some of the sophomores in my class, and I absolutely love it. So let's get started. On my first slide, I'd like to start off a little bit about Slow Food's take on the importance of natural resources. So we have to focus on protecting natural resources for future generations. Those of you who are here are probably very familiar with this concept and might be preaching to the choir, but the realization is that we need to understand life itself is supported directly from our soil. When you look at it, a handful of healthy soil contains more microorganisms than there are total people on the planet. Life in soil supports growth of more flavorful, nutritionally dense food, which overall provides us with more essential vitamins and minerals. The more you care for the soil, the more you care for biodiversity, the more food you'll be able to produce overall. So what does healthy soil mean? Healthy soil actually comes into the ballpark of making us healthy as well as humans. supporting the plants, and even livestock, which we don't always think about soil and livestock being directly connected. When plants are healthy, they absorb more nutrients, which means the food that we eat contains higher amounts of essential vitamins and minerals. This in turn means healthier people and healthier animals, which is less trips to the doctor, the vet, and less need for antibiotics. You kind of can start where I'm seeing going in this direction, focusing on that we actually are what we eat. People have said that for a long period of time, and whether or not we agree with it is irrelevant, but really it comes down to the fact that we are what we eat, and so is what we eat. And I think that's an important value to realize. We're not realizing that the earth has lost a third of its farmable soil in the last 40 years. 1/3 of our farmable soil has been diminished in the last 40 years. In the US, we're losing soil at 10 times the rate it takes to regenerate it, which is a rapid increase. But there's some really good news. We're beginning to discover a term called regenerative farming. And if you're not familiar with it, basically what it means is we're tapping into nature for soil support and pest management. The methods increase biodiversity by using zero waste composting practices, vermicomposting, where you can take compostable materials, add redworms into it, and create humic substances. This assists in capturing water and carbon when added to the soil and brings life to the soil. It enriches the soil with those microorganisms I mentioned. It improves watersheds by reducing excess fertilizer runoff and allowing vegetative growth for natural filtration in streams, waters, and lakes. Lastly, the aspect of regenerative farming is it enhances the ecosystem services by capturing the carbon emissions we hear so much about that actually contribute to climate change. If you don't believe me, that's fine, but even the USDA is actually starting a program. Ohio Department of Ag is realizing that recent heritage farming has had a huge impact on our natural resources. An Ohio USDA grant called H2 Ohio is new programming locally throughout the state with goals that are to limit agricultural phosphorus runoff in our water system. To talk a little bit more about that, I'd like you to jump online when you get an opportunity and just Google H2 Ohio. You'll be able to click the first link and they'll walk you through processes, but I want to talk about the most important processes that are linked directly to slow foods. What they're doing is actually reteaching, if you will, soil testing, which tells farmers where to fertilize, what to use, when fertilizing, and how frequently they should be using it. They're actually going back to organic practicing by emphasizing the importance of mixing in manure to minimize nutrient loss in the soil. They're using crop rotation and cover crops to reduce runoff, reduce erosion, hold nutrients, and improve overall soil health. But not only in the growing areas are they impacting it, but they're actually using the outside circumferences of farmers' plots and their acreage by implementing what's called the edge of the field buffers. So they're actually planting trees, shrubs, and strips of grass that decrease runoff to promote biodiversity. The last aspect of what this is focusing on is promoting wetlands as a filter. So they're supporting the ecosystems for native plants, animals, and insects. We need to start focusing on feeding the soil and not just feeding the plant, which leads me to my second slide, honing in a little bit of helping people and the environment depend on one another. So the term sustainability is loosely learned in a lot of different, used in a lot of different aspects when we talk about food production. But I like to talk primarily about the three aspects of sustainable food that matter most to us here locally. The first side of it is the social piece. It's creating a culture around food. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The second aspect of it is the environmental piece. Understanding the natural resource usage in food production. A lot of us never focus on that. We run to the grocery store, we buy what we want, when we want, whether it's in season or not, and we take what we can when we get the opportunity, not thinking of how it's produced to get to that point. The unfortunate thing is it's said at our current rate, we have an estimated of 60 years of farmable soil left on our planet. And most of that's due to unsustainable agriculture practices of late between the last 75 to 100 years total. The third part of that sustainable wheel is the economic piece, which is the most controversial piece when it comes to what it looks like locally in our food system. It's an exchange of currency, but it's not just an exchange of currency for food directly. There's an exchange of currency in the process of that food being produced. So not only the goods that we purchase directly, but how we produce that food, which a lot of us forget about. How much does it cost for the water? How much is the farmer paying for the seeds? What do they pay for soil support? And actually other growth, pest management, herbicides, fungicides all come into play as well. It costs the farmer a certain amount of money to produce the food that we eat on a daily basis. Not only that, but food regions come into play, which more often than not in the US is a global aspect. This is distribution, manufacturing, and the retail piece of the aspect of food as a system. All of these have a major aspect on our food cost. An example is the question that a lot of my students ask is, how is there a 99-cent cheeseburger? How is it possible? I open up in response and asking them the question more often than not, how can a drought in the Midwest impact the cost of steak? This directly links them to grain costs of the cattle farmers and overall just supply and demand. This is a trifecta, and it also creates subcategories. So first is the social environmental piece. Now we're at a point in 2020, we recognize food production is responsible for negative impacts on our earth. We know that. And if you're not just realizing it now, if you're focused on climate change, it's fine. But even our agricultural units, the USDA, are realizing that we've got to make some changes here. The second piece is the eco-economy. And you're going to wonder what that means, but many businesses have been created 100% around alternative energy resources, creating jobs around these alternative energy fields. So we can talk about wind turbines, we can talk about solar panel farms, and there's so much coming into the works that's creating other job opportunities for what our eco-economy looks like. The third aspect of the subcategories is socioeconomics. We are now seeing the value of supporting local farmers, local chefs, and local farmers markets. In turn, we're supporting growth of continued advancing of sustainable products. Examples of those are future farming techniques. People are focusing on aquaculture, using fish as manure to be able to fertilize their foods more naturally, cycle that water through. We're using and seeing more frequent usage of vertical farms. And if you don't know much about vertical farms, you can actually fit 40 plants in a 2 square foot radius, using 90% less water and 50% less fertilizer. It's astounding. Back to the regenerative farming aspect of it, the idea science is taking us backwards to traditional agriculture practices in order for us to move forward is keeping up with the growing population. They say anticipating that we're almost at 8 billion people right now in 2020, and by 2050, we could be approaching 10 billion. What are we going to do? And science is focusing on how to retain our natural resources and what to do with it. It starts with finding new ways to promote soil life. Scientists are studying the use of things like sea kelp, mycorrhiza, algae to make something called biochar, which is absolutely incredible and something that I really suggest you look into. Biochar is the future, the direction of ways that we're finding to revitalize our soil faster. Which leads me to slide number 3. How do we become so resilient? Well, in my opinion, it's education, without a doubt. Maybe I'm partial growing up in a house as a mom as an educator for 35 years, but the reality of it is we have to figure out where we can resolve some of these issues. It's the social sustainability piece that I want to talk about now and creating these resiliency pieces for our future generations to come. Slow Food says promote food that is local, seasonal, and sustainably grown. Educating students and the community on their power as a consumer is the key in forcing the food system shift from what it is currently accessible right now to us as individuals. One of my favorite quotes that I found recently is by Confucius. It says, if your plan is for 1 year, plant rice. If your plan is for 10 years, plant trees. But if your plan is for 100 years, you need to educate children. At Slow Food Reynoldsburg schools, in my school program, we start with an introduction. We call it PBL. For those in the education field, it's actually called problem-based learning. What's the problem? How can we react to that problem? How do we fix this? It's recognizing solutions to the problems that we have at hand. And those are the best resolutions in figuring out how we can educate students, is giving them a problem and asking them to solve it. The reality is introducing them to who's doing what locally. Where are they actually doing this? When can I buy those products? When can I meet this farmer? Why does it matter? And how are they doing it? I've got a group of interns that have capstone projects where they actually become community advocates. They go back to elementary schools to support and teach the things that we've discovered and learned in my classroom. We've made applesauce. We talked about canning, jarring, and preserving. I've sent a group over to one of our elementary schools where they actually did a taste test with the students to talk about our homemade applesauce versus the applesauce that you can buy at the grocery store. It's astonishing what kids will do when they actually get to eat food. All of a sudden, everyone starts paying attention. It's kind of funny. But what we're doing is creating a sustainable education program. For us, as they become role models in the community, the younger students will eventually get to me at the high school level. It's all about building relationships, in my opinion, especially when it comes to supporting local. Educating ourselves in order to educate others, which means we learn about GMOs, and I know Slow Foods is anti, but we have to understand the process and see where we might be able to make improvements in some of the faults that these processes have potentially become. There's nothing worse than an uneducated opinion being spread as facts. In my opinion, this only contributes to slowing down and advancing of production of food with integrity. It slows down that process. Personally, I'm pro-food. I want to know the best way to feed my 5-year-old son and the best foods possible that I can do it for the least amount of money. So it starts with sustainability piece, but the social sustainability is vital right now. If we want to change the composition of the soil, it starts with talking to one another as individuals. So I have a challenge for you. We know social media is a powerful tool. That's how most of you found out about this event tonight. So I challenge you to meet some local farmers. Follow them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you can see them, and share their posts. Walk through the nearest farmer's market. Actually talk to the farmer, ask their process, build relationships with them, follow them, and share their posts. If you follow local restaurants and breweries, you'll find the ones who are doing it right, who actually have mass buying power over us as consumers at a small level. Ask them about where your food comes from, have them tell you the story, like them on social media, and share their posts. But it doesn't just stop there. That's the obvious thing that we can do as consumers. But I also challenge you to find your local education programming. And here's where the good news in times where we need it the most is that there are so many people here in the Columbus area who are doing phenomenal things with education programming that have major influences on what the future food system looks like. Cynthia Walters is our state governor of Slow Foods, and she's part of a program called School Gardens of Ohio. They work on building curriculum in classrooms. Ohio Department of Education has sort of always been on board with ag and food science, but now we can implement it directly into the classroom. They use a lot of Future Farmers of America curriculum. And in a sense, we can be able to mold that as teachers to help these students understand where their buying power lies. We always had Franklin Park Conservatory and Bill Dawson in his Growing to Green program. The 4-H Project Green teacher is huge. OSU's extension is always reaching out in individual counties between Franklin County and Delaware County to make sure that they're helping support school garden programming. Franklin County Public Health, this is one of my favorites, has a My Plate, My State, where they actually have at least once a month in a cafeteria program at multiple school district levels, where they buy each product for something, and it's all Ohio based. They have a map that goes on the board, and they slap some magnets onto it to kind of tell the kids that this is where your food's coming from. Reynoldsburg, for instance, last year, one of them was Sloppy Joe's. Even the Sloppy Joe sauce was Ohio-based product, and that's awesome. Mid-Ohio Food Bank is doing some great things, and in the future, you're going to see a farming STEM program. It's actually an educational farm over at Hilltop, where they're taking some abandoned areas and turning it into an educational facility. Ohio Department of Agriculture is building an educational farm out in Reynoldsburg on Main Street Avenue. If you've ever been out that direction, it's going to be an opportunity for them to bring students in to meet the scientists directly. The Columbus Zoo Teen Eco Summit, it was awesome. There's an amazing individual I met this year named Sasa Shajetic from Hocking College, and she runs the agroforestry program there where they focus primarily on organic growing. Columbus Garden School is another great ability around here. Franklinton Farms has always been a staple. Jorgensen's Farms, another great staple. Growing Matters is linked to Local Matters. And just finding local farmers markets who are trying to create education programs. The last thing that you need to focus on is finding that Ohio Proud label. Being there, looking at it, and recognizing that that's something even at Kroger, Meijer, or even other small businesses locally, that you can find that logo that helps support and sustain our local economy. In my personal opinion, to sum it all up, it takes the will of the people throughout the community. And to be quite honest with you, now more than ever, I think that time is coming.
Great, thanks so much, Trevor, for the first presentation. I'm gonna try and move us along to our second one and unmute Katie's microphone here. And Katie is our co-chair for events for Slow Food Columbus, and she's also the CSA coordinator and retail manager at Jorgensen's Farms.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mark. And thank you, Trevor, so much. That was a really, really beautiful presentation you put together. Also, thank you for the shout out. That basically sums up what I do. I am the CSA coordinator, retail manager at Jorgensen Farms. I'm going to be talking a little bit about exactly what our farming practices are and how that actually relates to what clean food is. So I'm gonna go ahead and take my video off, but hopefully you can still hear my voice. And if any point during my presentation, I talk about something that is a little, excuse me, confusing to you, you are more than welcome to write down my email and shoot me a question or two. I'm happy to elaborate on anything I talk about. All right, so you wanna head to the next slide? Perfect. So Trevor mentioned a lot of really interesting things when he talked about the idea of regenerative farming. Essentially, that is what we do at Jorgensen Farms, and I'm going to try to break everything down for you. But the main thing to remember about regenerative farming is that everything is connected within that system, and it starts with soil health. As Trevor said, soil health is the baseline for generating healthy plants, and then that translates directly to us in generating, a healthy immune system, especially in a time like today. So I'm going to go through a couple of the most important aspects of how to create healthy soil. It's going to be a base level understanding of it. There's a lot that I still don't know in, working as a farmer. This is only my third year working as a farmer, so I'm still learning as we go. So we'll be talking about what tilling is, what cover cropping is, and I'll get a little deeper into what composting and organic matter is. I know Trevor did talk about some composting methods and some really interesting materials that we use to help revitalize our soil. The next thing I'm going to talk about is something called intensive spacing and why that helps bolster our ecosystem a little bit more. And then after that, I'm going to go into integrative pest and weed management, which you'll probably be surprised to hear. We don't use any chemicals or chemical pesticides or herbicides. So let's jump right in. I'll start talking to you about what tilling is. So when you look up tilling online, and I literally put in tilling in Wikipedia, and this is the first thing that comes up: to prepare and cultivate land for crops. Now, what exactly does that mean? You have two pictures here. One on the left is this big giant hulking machine with these discs that seems to be digging up the soil a lot. And then on the right-hand side, you have a much smaller little machine that's it looks like fluffing the soil a little bit. Tilling essentially is a way for farmers to be able to work up their soil to make it easier for them to plant in. In Ohio, we have very dense clay heavy soil. which means that the particles are going to be very, very small. They're going to stick together. They're going to make these giant clumps that make it very difficult for farmers to actually, put a seed into the ground. It's not as easy as just, taking a seed and shoving it into the ground and hoping something comes up. We want to create a nice environment for our seeds to grow. And the reason why tilling is so important, why it's so important or has been in the past to work up that soil and to create something more pliable for us, is so that we can put that seed in the ground and have it expand its roots, so that we can give it a home for those roots to expand and grow and be able to take up nutrients from the soil. Now, for centuries, tilling has been the number one way that people have been able to work up the soil to a good fine grain, to be able to provide a good space for their plants to grow. But up until recently, we haven't really known that much about our soil. In this current day and age, with all the technology that we have, we actually understand more about the universe above us and the deepest parts of the ocean than we do about what's happening in the soil beneath our feet. And it's only been in recent years that studies have shown that there is a world, a literal world beneath our feet that helps to encourage the growth of our plants. And when I say world, I'm talking about millions of different kinds of microbes, bacteria, fungi, even other kinds of creatures, worms, beetles, anything that you can imagine that lives down there facilitates the growth of our plants. And what scientists have found at the same time is that tilling has been killing a lot of that. A traditional tiller, like the one that you see on the left, is going to dig up about 1.5 feet, sometimes 2 feet worth of soil at a time to develop that nice top layer to plant your seeds in. But at the same time, it's getting rid of all of those beautiful microbes that are facilitating the growth of those roots, which means in the past, we've had to rely more on certain kinds of chemical fertilizers to provide those nutrients back into the soil. Tilling also, because it digs up the earth so much, it actually increases the amount of erosion that's possible. So if you put your seeds down and if there's no nutrients for it to be able to take up because all of that microbiome has been churned up, even if it does develop roots, it's a weaker root system, and it's more likely that those nutrients are going to wash away, that any fertilizers that you put down on the ground or any additional chemicals that you place, it's all going to wash away. Nothing is going to be retained. So what we're trying to do now at Jorgensen is we're using a much smaller version of that conventional tiller, and that's what you see on the right-hand side. This is called a BCS. It's a very small tiller, and it basically only digs a couple inches on the topsoil. It doesn't disturb the microbiome as much. It's not a perfect system. It still does disturb things a little bit, but it enables us to still plant our seeds in a loosened environment to allow those roots to grow, but it's not disrupting the major part of that soil system, so that those nutrients are still going to be available for the plant to take up. So that's the main benefit of not tilling as much, but it also, there's something called compaction that is a result of using large machinery like these big tractors here. You can see those giant wheels are probably twice as big as I am. That actually serves to tamp down the soil a little bit more, which makes it difficult and more difficult for roots to grow. And it also adds to less water retention. If the soil is that compacted, the water's just gonna go whoop, straight off and run off into the nearest field or river, stream, or road. So by using smaller tires that are not as heavy, it doesn't compact the soil as much, which again helps for the root development of the plant. And then of course, all of this goes to contributing to the reduction of fossil fuels and our reliance on fossil fuels. This tiny little tractor that we use uses probably a fraction of the amount of fossil fuels that that tractor on the left does. So there's a lot of benefits in using that. And if we head to the next slide, this is an example of what a traditional or conventional tilled plot can result in. On the left-hand side, you see that the color of the soil is very light. There are very small roots that have barely broken through the surface. That indicates that there is no or very little microbiome in there that is facilitating the growth of those root systems. So that kind of a system is the reason why that we have been reliant on fertilizers and pesticides and a whole bunch of other chemicals to try to do what the plant is naturally supposed to be able to do on its own, which is on the right-hand side. This is a system where the microbiome has been supported, where there's a lot more growth and there's a lot more activity happening in that soil. It's darker in color, the roots are happier, they're able to actually extend far down into the earth, and they're able to reap more benefits from that. So that's an overview of tilling. Obviously, there's a lot more that goes with it, but there are other aspects of keeping our soil healthy. And if we go to the next slide, I can talk about what cover cropping is. So cover cropping essentially is a way for farmers to help manage a lot of different things in an ecosystem. It manages soil erosion, fertility, and the quality of our plants. I should start by saying that any plant out there technically can be a cover crop, although you might not want it to be. You could technically cover crop with tomatoes, although I don't think anybody would really benefit from that. So cover cropping is a way to kind of blanket your soil to help when you are not growing full crops on it, so that it helps root systems retain water. It helps to provide more nutrients into the soil after a season is over. So excuse me, let's say a full season of farming is done and we want to try to revitalize our soil. It's probably a little bit exhausted after all of the growing that we've done. We're going to plant something like legumes, like peas, or a wheat variety. We're going to plant it very, very densely in like a large blanket all over our entire field. And what that's going to do throughout the winter when we are not when we're not growing anything, it's going to develop root systems beneath the soil, and that's going to contribute very, very valuable organic matter. At the same time, it's going to prevent the soil on the surface from washing away. It's going to prevent any fertility that was built up, so any nutrients and any minerals that plants would be vital to plants. It's going to hold on to those, and it's also going to help in the spring reduce the weed pressure. Which is very important for farmers, especially because it's a very time-consuming process to remove weeds. So cover cropping, essentially, it bolsters, it helps, maintain the structure of the soil, and it also helps to bolster biodiversity and wildlife. Planting numerous species and rotating those crops throughout the season helps to develop a more friendly ecosystem for a number of different birds, critters, insects, and all of those combine to help create healthier plants. I circled increased surface runoff here because I know Trevor mentioned how important that is. So cover cropping really does help to reduce that issue. So talking about compost, there's a lot that goes into compost. We get a lot of questions about how people can compost in their own homes. This is a basic diagram to show you that there are basically two different components to creating healthy compost. Anything once living that can decompose can be counted as organic matter, which is essentially what compost is. And we put that onto our soil, again, to develop that deep microbiome, that beautiful organic matter helps our plants develop to be healthy and strong. So brown stuff, in case you can't read what this little infographic says, is dry leaves, wood chips, shredded paper, sawdust, and straw and hay and cardboard. Any of those things can be composted. And what you like to do with that in order to get a good composting system going is you actually want to layer them and sandwich them on top of each other. So if you did want to create your own composting system, you can actually create a nice little pile of dried leaves, and then you can throw on top of it something like coffee grounds, tea bags, fruit and vegetables from your garden or from your kitchen. And then you can cover it again with shredded paper or shredded cardboard. Just make sure that the paper you are shredding does not have any ink on it, because that won't break down. And then we get a lot of questions also about meat and fish. Don't throw those on your compost pile. That's an entirely different process. But compost is important, again, because it supports our microbiome. It's what we use to help bolster our specific soil makeup. Like I said, we have a lot of clay on the farm, so adding organic matter helps to break up that clay and helps to create a more suitable environment for root development. It adds more nutrients for your crops. It allows, again, for better water retention, and healthier crops will be less susceptible to disease. So that's just a very basic overview of what composting is. If you have any further questions, please let me know at the end, or feel free to send me an email about that. Another thing that we do is intensive spacing. So we try to reduce the amount of land that we are farming on, because that actually reduces the amount of resources that we need. So less water use. Intensive spacing also allows us to grow more in a smaller space. And it's basically sort of like a miniature cover cropping. You can see in this very, the picture over on the left-hand side, that's spinach. We plant it all very closely together. It helps pack in a lot more product for us and a lot less space. So minimizes our land use and maximizes our output. And it does reduce weed pressure as well. So another important aspect of a regenerative farming system is integrative pest management. If you do the system correctly, if you let Mother Nature kind of take care of itself, that's essentially what happens. Our pest management are bugs. They take care of themselves. So these are, this is a praying mantis over on the right-hand side that I actually took last year on the farm. He's digging around in our oregano. And he takes care of a whole lot of pests for us, a whole lot of bugs, a whole lot of issues. We thank them for that. Wasps are another incredibly beneficial biological pest manager. That picture over on the left-hand side there, that is a tomato hornworm. And those tiny little white things coming out of it, I'm sorry to say, are wasp eggs. Wasps like to parasitize their prey. So a lot of wasps on the farm will help get rid of pests like a tomato hornworm, which can destroy a tomato crop. And believe me, we've had them. They're terrible. So we don't have to use as many pesticides when using integrative pest management. But another thing that we use to try to reduce pest pressure is insect netting. It's our go-to for a lot of crops, a lot of things, delicate greens like arugula, brassicas, kale. Flea beetles love them. These are these tiny, tiny little black beetles that will devastate an entire crop. They'll make your arugula look like Swiss cheese. Still edible, but I mean, you know, it's very holy. So this helps to kind of keep out a lot of different types of pests. And it still allows for the plants to get enough water, enough sunlight, and enough fresh air. And we do try to create a schedule that we cover them and uncover them as needed. And then lastly, if we do have to use some sort of product to help get rid of something very intense as a very last resort, these are two naturally derived certified organic products that you can use in your own garden. If you go to any garden store, they are available. The first there is called diatomaceous earth, and it's essentially calcium deposits. They are, you'll notice it says 100% pure freshwater diatomaceous earth. They come from calcified algae, essentially, is what you would be putting down on your plants. The one thing I do recommend is wearing a mask if you do ever decide to use it on your plants. It's not good to inhale. It's a very, very fine dust particle. It is food grade safe, although you, of course, want to wash your produce whenever you purchase it, or if you decide to use this product, always wash your produce. But essentially, the bugs or any kind of pests will roll on it or eat it, and it acts as kind of like fiberglass, so they're not too happy with that. And then neem oil, I'm sure most of you have heard, it's derived from a natural tree resin. Again, it is not harmful to the plants, not that harmful to the environment. If you use it as a spray on your plants, it should repel any of the pests you are trying to get rid of. Again, we use these only as a last resort. We typically try to use our regular integrative pest management, our natural practices, to try to facilitate a larger biodiversity within our system to help kind of take care of itself. So those are all of the different methods that we use at Jorgensen Farms. Please, if you have any questions or if you want me to elaborate on anything at the end of the discussion, I'm more than happy to. But this is essentially what clean farming looks like, trying to reduce pressure on your ecosystem and trying to bolster it instead and work with it instead of against it. So thank you.
Great, and thanks so much, Katie, for that wonderful presentation. Again, as Katie mentioned, if you've got any questions, please feel free to add that to our chat group so that way we can look through those later and hopefully get to all of those. All right, for our final presentation, I've unmuted Andrea's microphone, and she is the President's Postdoctoral Scholar at the School of Environment and Natural Resources at OSU, and she's also an economic anthropologist, and she'll be talking about her work at this point.
Great. I want to start by saying a big thank you to you, Mark, for organizing this panel and then reorganizing it as a Zoom panel, which is a lot of like bonus organizational labor that you took on to make sure we could still meet. That is super appreciated. And thanks to everybody who's hanging out with us online on this kind of quiet evening. And to Trevor and Katie, who set this up for me super well. I'm really grateful to both of you for the presentations you just gave and the detail about why we need to protect natural resources and promote local, sustainably grown food, as well as the actual techniques that let people do that work. Yeah, so like Mark said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Ohio State. I'm in environment and natural resources now. My background is in anthropology, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and an issue that came up a lot during the ongoing fieldwork that I have actually in Iowa around clean food. So if you want to show the first slide. So I have an ongoing research project with beginning alternative farmers in Iowa. By beginning farmer, I mean somebody that has been in charge of the day-to-day operations and decision-making on their farm for less than 10 years. And by alternative agriculture, I mean basically the type of farming that Katie and Trevor were just talking about. So in the Iowa context, it means specifically small-scale, low-input farms growing food for local markets. And I have some photos and these are all the farms that I went to. And I have some photos, yeah, on this slide. And so I'm interested particularly as an anthropologist in how this system of food production relates to the larger scale commodity grain agriculture that's more common in Iowa. So both how farms that produce food like this draw upon the infrastructure that's most of the state, you know, so like most of what Iowa ag is large scale corn and bean production. So how folks like this draw upon that infrastructure, and then also how they resist it in certain ways. One of the things that surprised me when I started fieldwork, when I was getting my feet wet in Iowa, was how much cooperation can actually exist across different production spheres. So somebody that didn't grow up on a farm and is a couple of years into running their own, you know, certified organic vegetable operation might not really know what to do when their tractor breaks down for the first time, but their neighbor or their landlord who's growing conventional GM corn probably does. And so, you know, I talked to a lot of folks who were reliant on people like that to help them with fixing equipment, with putting their fences up, with just general advice. So there's definitely some cooperation across this type of you know, production divide, but as you might expect, there's some tensions as well. And one of the biggest points of tension between these systems is spray drift. So the farms that I worked on, yeah, perfect, thank you. We're surrounded by large-scale grain monocultures that are being sprayed with a whole bunch of things. For the purposes of this talk, I'm focusing mostly on herbicides like atrazine and glyphosate. More recently, dicamba has also been used more often as weeds have started to become more resistant to glyphosate. Dicamba has been getting a lot of attention for how much it volatilizes as well. But all of these chemicals are really important inputs for grain producers. They need this type of herbicide in order to hold down the weed pressure, because they're not using, you know, the suite of production practices that Katie was just talking about. It's a different system that's more input intensive. All of these herbicides that are being sprayed on grain crops have very specific application instructions. They can either be applied aerially or on a tractor mounted sprayer, but they have very detailed applicator instructions for when they can be applied. So what time of day, how hot outside it can be, for how you know, what the wind speed can be is a really big, important one. It should not be that fast. And none of these herbicides are intended to end up on food for human consumption, right? Like the corn and the soybeans that are being grown in Iowa as well as in Ohio don't end up on human plates almost ever. They're intended for livestock feed, or they're used in ethanol production, or they're you know, turned into consumer products. But things don't always go as planned, right? We know this. Sometimes honest mistakes happen and somebody misjudges the wind speed. Sometimes applicators are just really rushed and they just bend the rules a little bit, or there's only a really short window between rains. When that happens, industrial herbicides can move beyond the fields for which they're intended, and they can contaminate nearby fields, which causes a lot of complicated issues, not the least of which is the food that these, you know, smaller scale vegetable farmers are working so hard to grow is suddenly no longer clean. But I want to emphasize that this isn't just an issue for vegetable producers in the Corn Belt. It's an issue for anybody that's growing a crop that hasn't been genetically modified to be resistant to those herbicides. So if you're growing even just normal hybrid corn, you know, that's going to be susceptible to drift as well. If you're growing organic soybeans for organic livestock feed, you're going to be susceptible to drift as well. So it's a broader issue than something that just applies to vegetable farmers. But vegetable farmers are certainly quite vulnerable to it. I wanted to let two farmers who I know through my field work tell a little bit of their own story. So I have a video queued up on the next slide that's been put on by this grassroots organization called Practical Farmers of Iowa, as they were trying to raise awareness around the issue of drift. So it's just a really short 3-minute video with two farmers talking about their experiences.
When we hear spraying, it makes my blood pressure go up. Like I actually causes me stress. We put a lot of ourselves into the fly. And I don't think that's untrue for other farmers who do other things. If we had an overspray incident with an airplane especially, and they were careless enough to kind of do it at a little bit higher altitude with the wind conditions just right, they potentially could contaminate the entire vegetable operation with one pass. But pretty much for me, the day stops when there's an application nearby. And some of it is because we did have a misapplication incident on our farm. So we've been burned once. We lost a fair amount in that incident. So we're going to be skittish. I think rightfully so. We're going to be just a little nervous.
So our CSA shares are split kind of between the Iowa City corridor, Des Moines, and here in Grinnell. And it tends to be people who are interested in eating local seasonal produce. We have a lot of people with small children who want to make their own baby food for really young ones, or making sure that their kids are eating healthy produce.
We're a 14-acre farm in the middle of corn and soybean country. So a 14-acre farm doesn't seem like much to most people. But on this farm, we grow about 5 acres of diversified vegetables. We raise turkeys, ducks, chickens, chickens for meat, chickens for egg. We also have a couple of high tunnel or covered buildings that we grow inside. We are certified organic, and we provide our own insurance by having a diverse set of crops.
I'm outside every day that it's possible to be outside during the growing season. And if it's good enough to spray, I guarantee you we have people in the field. And so we witness from our farm drift incidents happen up the road, down the road, all the time. Like this happens every year, very frequently. And whether it be in someone's yard or someone's field.
If there's an overspray incident on this farm, whether it's drift or somebody flies over with nozzles on or whatever, one of the things that happens is any crops that are ripe and ready at that time, we have to suspend picking. We cannot, until tests come back, harvest any of that because we have to know it's clean. You need to remember that if I give this produce to somebody and this is fresh produce, if I give the fresh produce to them and say, here, eat this, I have basically told them it's safe. And if they get sick because there's something on the product, who's liable? That would be me. I would be liable for them getting sick. So
I need to take responsibility for the quality of the produce and what might be on that produce.
And so I don't think they're really aware that maybe it has the potential to cause economic harm or health harm, or, you know, a lot of these chemicals aren't labeled for human consumption. So even if you think it's safe, if it's not labeled for human consumption, I need to destroy that crop if it gets sprayed on mine, because what we're selling isn't going into an ethanol plant or you know, a cow's rumen. It's being eaten by people.
Great, I'm so glad that worked. So Rob and Andy were just running it through some of their frustrations with drift. They're both small scale organic vegetable farms in Iowa that experienced pretty significant drift accidents. You know, on one hand, drift seems like a pretty cut and dry kind of simple issue. You know, chemicals intended for one field got on a different field. But on the other hand, especially from the anthropological angle, where, you know, being on farm with folks, being there as there was the threat of drift happening on windy days, the fear of, you know, potential drift kind of at all times during the growing season, the remembered incidents of drift in past years. It's a more complex issue than just that as well. So I'm gonna try to just synthesize what I think are some of the key parts for understanding the human elements of spray drift for the rest of my time. So one of the most frustrating things about it is it's not really something that you have any power over. It's really hard to avoid. You don't have control over it as a grower. So you can be doing, you know, you can be doing cover cropping and no-till and integrated pest management and all of the, you know, really elegant production practices that we just learned about, and have all of your hard work wiped out in one windy day. You know, good neighbor relationships can help, having open communication with your neighbors and being able to say, hey, like, definitely let me know, let's talk about what your spray schedule is. That can help, but it's not always your neighbor farmer who's doing their own applications. They very well might just be hiring a commercial applicator who's on a really tight schedule, who's never met you before, and who just kind of needs to get his job done and get onto his next farm. In addition to being hard to avoid, it can be really hard to prove. So sometimes you're out in the field and you can see the plane or you can see the tractor with the, you know, booms out coming up, but sometimes you just see the spots. So these are two photos of like pretty cut and dry spray drift damage on, these are both herbicide drift. So there's cucumber plants on the top and peas below. This is like pretty classic drift damage, but it's not always so easy to tell. Sometimes there's a question where your plants didn't look like this yesterday and you come out and look at them and you're not sure, is it insect damage? Is it a disease that you don't yet know how to recognize because you're still kind of a new farmer? Is it blight? There's also this added complication where crops that have been drifted on then become more susceptible to blight. So, you know, it can be kind of an open question. Is it blight? Is it drift? Is it blight caused by drift? That can be really stressful and frustrating. I worked with one farmer who was pretty sure he'd been drifted on. He hadn't seen it happen, but he had it narrowed down to the, you know, day that he noticed his plants starting to look worse. And he did a land walk with his landlord and pointed out the damage. And his landlord didn't believe him. He was like, this just looks like disease to me. I don't think this is drift. And the farmer was so sure of his, you know, disease management. He was like, I really don't think my plants are sick, that he paid to get it tested on his own. He knew that his neighbor had been spraying atrazine and Callisto the day in question, and the samples came back all positive for atrazine, but they were also positive for glyphosate, and nobody that he knew had been spraying glyphosate that day. So he was like, well, where's that even coming from? This must be drifting a lot further than I recognize as possible. But the silver lining of that is that his landlord took those test results, once there was some objective proof, really seriously, and kind of like reconsidered his dismissive attitude and ended up putting in 50 acres of organic hay as kind of an additional buffer around the more vulnerable vegetable fields. But that was, you know, because the farmer had paid for his own private lab tests. there's implications immediately when you get drifted on, and then there's longer term implications when you get drifted on. So right away, when a bad drift accident happens, it can be really scary and also really uncertain what the next steps are. Remember, so these are organic farmers who don't use chemicals like these, so they don't necessarily really know what the best practices are or what safety procedures they should follow. They don't have any experience with this type of chemical by choice. And so it's like, do I take my shirt off and put it in the washing machine right away? Do I need to save it in a bag to get tested? Should I send my employees home, or do we need to start washing out all of the harvest bins? Or do I need to move the chickens? Are these eggs safe? How do I collect foliar samples? Who do I send foliar samples to? How do I get in touch with the applicator's employer to report them? These are just not the sorts of things that you really want to be dealing with in the middle of the growing season. And certainly not any needed additional stress for people, in the middle of the summer. We talked earlier about how these chemicals aren't intended for human food. They're also not intended to go on human bodies. And so one farmer who I worked with actually felt herbicide droplets on his skin when a overhead aerial applicator flew over and didn't quite turn off his nozzles in time. And he felt it on his skin and felt like he was overly sensitive to the sun for the next several weeks, that he was, more photosensitive on his skin. Other farmers have told me about feeling like their asthma gets triggered and they have kind of, respiratory issues after a drift incident. Obviously, there's also going to be economic implications for farms after they get drifted on. This, when atrazine, when glyphosate or whatever goes onto your farm, you have to obviously throw away those crops and lose that money, but that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the economic implications for farmers. So drift doesn't always kill the plant, right? The crop might survive, and the crop might even be safe to eat from after a certain period of time. So you have to research that. You have to figure out when it becomes safe again. But say that you are 15 days out from having peas ready to harvest and sell, and you get drifted on and you are able to determine that in 30 days, the peas would be, safe to eat, not organic, but safe to eat. So you wait 15 days and then they start to set, and then you have 15 more days before they're safe, but you still have to pay labor to harvest those peas in those 15 days. So you're paying somebody, or you're doing it yourself, to go out there, pick the first 2 weeks of peas and then throw them away, which is expensive and really demoralizing. You also stands to lose your organic certification after you get drifted on. So it takes 3 years of using organic practices to be certified organic. And after you get drifted on, it resets your organic clock back to 0. This costs even more money. You have to pay for the certification again and do all of the work of growing organically and checking all of the organic boxes for 3 years, but you're not allowed to sell that produce technically as organic during that time. So that's an additional kind of longer term cost to being drifted on. In terms of human relationships, those can also be really challenging during times of negotiating drift incidents. Something that comes up a lot is the question of, well, should I sue? Like I lost this much money by having to redo my organic certification. I lost this much money in, potential crops that I could have sold, but now I can't sell them. I spent all this money on labor. Who should I sue? But what's missing from that conversation sometimes is really what people are talking about is suing their neighbor or suing the applicator that their neighbor hired. This is really fraught and tense and can, produce all kinds of stressful ongoing relationships that aren't, not really what people sign up for when they start farms. In addition to neighbor relationships, there's also, it can be a trying time with customer relationships where you're asking your customers who signed up with one understanding of, the health and organic nature and cleanliness of the food that they were going to be buying from you. And you're asking them to now kind of come to a different understanding if you're no longer certified organic. This kind of event can lead to much more transparent, or not much more transparency, but kind of a whole new level of transparency in relationships with customers and a new kind of communication. So you're saying, I know it's the middle of July and I normally have eggplants and peppers right now, but we have to throw away all of the eggplants and peppers that we're harvesting. I worked with one farm who during their CSA pickup, their CSA was set up so that their customers would come to the pickup site and then they would have all of the produce in different crates. And so people would just come with their bags and take, one head of lettuce and one bag of peppers and everything. And they brought empty crates for all of the produce that they had to throw away. So, it was kind of this striking and really heartbreaking visual reminder for the several weeks after of what the bounty of the season, normally looked like and what they were being denied, basically. You also have to, communicate things about, so that you have to, like Rob was saying in the video, you can't obviously sell anything or give to your CSA members something that is unsafe, but sometimes you don't know for sure. So you can tell your customers, I don't know if these eggs are safe. I'm eating them, but I couldn't find any data on herbicides, effect on laying hens, and just an overall increase in anxiety also follows. So if people want to learn more about drift, I put together just these very brief resources. PANA, the Pesticide Action Network North America, is engaged on a lot of fronts and a really good source of information, as well as steps that people can take. And Field Watch, which includes Bee Check and Drift Watch as well, is another very good one. I probably went over time, sorry. I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. I'm gonna now remove the stop sharing, and I'm gonna unmute Trevor and Katie as well here. And we've got about 5 or so minutes, and if folks need to leave, that's totally fine. Thank you all for listening to our 3 wonderful talks. If you've got questions, rather than trying to have multiple faces on here, I'm gonna just ask that you try and type in the group chat. If for some reason you can't get the chat function to work, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be what appears to be like a little hand, and you can just raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone temporarily there. So if we can get, I think, Andrea, Trevor, and Katie, if you can turn your video on, hopefully the bandwidth can handle all of this. I'll give us a few seconds, see if anyone's got any initial questions. Otherwise, I've got a list as I was listening to you all. Okay, well, I think while folks are thinking of questions to ask, again, just raise your hand with the little icon there, or just type a question in the group chat. The first question, I guess, for Trevor, I'm just curious, working with high school students, how difficult is it for them to understand aspects of clean? And how difficult was it for you to get the local school board on board with the kind of work that you're doing with Slow Food?
Oh, thanks for putting me on the spot. Well, to the first answer to your question is getting the students involved is creating engagement, some excitement, something that gives them a sense of ownership is where I've found it to be relatively successful. It's very interesting when they plant a green bean seed, and we go through the process of monitoring the germination process. Once they're introduced to it, they see it on a camera or like a our slideshow. They might see a picture of it and they can see it happening in a video, but until they actually do it themselves, there's a little bit of disconnect, I guess, if you will. And so the reality of it is then all of a sudden they planted their seed, they wrote their name on that, they watered it, and it germinates, and it becomes like a child to them. It's so weird, and it's really funny actually when you think about it long term, because they have no connection to anything necessarily, but all of a sudden they want to take this bean plant home, and it becomes so important. And so it's really a joy to see that happen from a perspective of you teaching them something that they've never necessarily been taught before. They've seen germination, and I think all of us at an elementary school level have been introduced to germination at some point in time, but they've never actually had germination be connected to their food. A flower is a flower. A sunflower grows and it's fine, right? But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, they don't see that that's how your food is produced. We grew watermelons and pumpkins last year as an example, and I cut them both in half. We took the seeds and we put them right back in the raised bed soil that we grew them in, and all of a sudden they're seeing plants grow again. And it's like, blows their mind that I say all the time, growing your own food's like printing your own money. You know, we bought those seeds originally and we're just using our seeds again. It's that simple. As far as the district's approach to it, I was fortunate to have support from a couple administrators prior to. Don McLeod, as an example, is one as a head administrator at HS Squared when I was first hired into the district, and Kevin Smith, who is a farmer in his own. He lives out in the Pataskala area, and he has a couple acres, I think it's 3 total, where he raises bees and he grows food for his family. And their connection directly was sort of a fortunate ensuite for me. But we need statistics. You know, we really need stats that prove that this is important. I talk about all the time that food is the connecting dot between all the other curriculum, between science, math, social studies, history. It's all related, and we can utilize this as that connecting point. And if they can't relate to math, they can relate to equations and ratios and measuring how much to put of something into the soil, as an example. You know, what we do with that, and the food aspect of it, again, is what builds their relationship between the concept of education and real life opportunities. So it was a challenge, but again, fortunately, the district saw it as to be a great opportunity. The career pathway is phenomenal. Most of Ohio Department of Education's agriculture and food science curriculum is rural based, you know, FFA, like I mentioned earlier, but we're taking it to a different level. I mean, we're at Bryce and Livingston Avenue, and we're on some tennis courts, and we're doing the same practices without livestock in a sense, but it's still implementing these soil supporting techniques that build a bond and effort between these students who have never left their blocks potentially and the farmers that are in Pataskala, which is 3 or 4 miles away. And really the contributions to that are astounding. The kids in Pataskala, they don't need to learn this. It's the kids in the urban setting who need to learn this, because these food deserts that we talk about so frequently, those are the environments that they live in. So if anyone, and there's any place that needs to focus and hone in on providing good, clean, fair food for everybody, it's the urban settings more than the rural ones.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Trevor. I just want to keep track of everyone's time. It is 7:15. That's our official end, but I do want to just at least get a question for Katie and Andrea. So again, if y'all need to leave, by all means, please feel free to do so. But Katie, let me ask you, you know, working with grape growers in Central Ohio, they do talk about the clay soils as well, and how difficult that is, you know, to get those roots down in there. And I'm curious what would your approach or your understanding be with being able to till the soil so you can actually dig in there, but not wanting to destroy the microbiome? Like, is that surface level kind of minimal tilling, is that enough to actually allow the roots to hold on to anything?
Yeah, so if you are doing it yourself, it might be a little bit more labor intensive. There are different methods that you can use to try to um, dig up the dirt a little bit more. So before we started using that small tiller, the BCS tractor that I showed you, we actually did hoe everything by hands. We had hoes and we were, chopping up the actual soil with our sweat and our our arms. So that is one way that you can do it. But if you do go online to places like Johnny's Seeds or High Mowing, there's a couple of farmers in upstate New York, I believe, Never Sink Tools. They have specific, very small scale tillers that you can use. They're called tilthers. It's drill operated. Anybody could use it. It is incredibly simple. You literally just attach it to the drill. You pull this little cord, and then it goes right down your lanes, and it's a lifesaver. So that's something I would recommend too. But otherwise, hard labor, sweat, and tears. That's what it takes.
Awesome, thanks. And then, Andrea, I was just wondering if you could talk a little about, this idea that for among the folks that you talk to, clean is safe, right? So earlier in our first lesson, or our first lecture, we were talking about how good food is healthy food and it's safe food for us, and that's what we want to consume. Same kind of thing with clean food, it seems. And I just want to know if you could talk a little bit about the economic and the social value that's placed on clean food and what that means in the research that you've been doing.
Oh, interesting. The economic and the social value that's placed on clean food. Yeah, I mean, I think there is this thing where people are willing to pay the higher prices at the farmer's market and pay the higher prices of a CSA membership because there can be, this perception that it's safer. Like Andy talked in the video about how a lot of his customers are parents with new babies who want to make their own baby food. They want to blend up the organic squash to really make sure that it's the safest food for their kid, and that's something that folks are willing to pay for. And kind of like you were just saying, Katie, willing to work a lot harder to produce, yeah, I think that there's a huge value that folks place on that then when atrazine or Callisto or Strategio drifts, it kind of acts as this contaminating agent that has objective scientific lab results that you can point to and say, this has done this thing, but it also acts as just this really scary introduction of an unknown, and there's so little, these chemicals are never intended to be on food for human consumption. So even if you're doing research and reading everything you can find on it, there's just not a lot of data on it because it was never intended to be on squash. So people just don't know. And that's, I think, one of the scariest pieces of it. Or if it's on your chickens, can you eat the eggs? Also came up a lot too. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, I wanted to thank all three of you for participating in this panel today. For me, at least, as a foodie and someone who's been part of Slow Food for a while, it's been great, listening to everything that you're saying from your different perspectives of what, again, that good clean, or that clean message looks like. I've just put here on the screen, hopefully everyone can see it. Just as a reminder, our final event for this series is on Wednesday, April 22nd. So about a month from now, we'll have Kareem Usher from City and Regional Planning, Cynthia Walters, who was mentioned, a school gardens advocate. And again, she's got a Slow Food Live event happening tomorrow at 2 p.m. And then JP Fritz, local Columbus foodie and owner of Lasting Impressions, he's going to share his experience here as well about what it means to be to eat slow food. You can also see that on the screen here at this shortened URL, that's the registration link for the final event. So by all means, go ahead and sign up for that, and we'll send you some reminders as we head toward that date. And then finally, you can see on the screen the Survey Monkey for this particular event. Just it's about 2 to 3 minutes for the survey, or you can also just take your phone and point it at the QR code. And if you can do that and fill that out, that'll help us a lot in terms of trying to plan for the next session. All right. So with that said, again, thank you for participating. And I hope everyone stays healthy and safe as the days and weeks continue on. Thanks so much.